This is the Norman Anderson Lifetime Achievement Award lecture that I gave to the Society of Experimental Psychologists on April 18th, 2015. These lectures review personal information about an awardee's life to provide the context for describing various of the awardee's major scientific accomplishments. So here goes. I usually feel like a lucky guy, and here's one big reason why. My wonderful family, notably my wife Gail Carpenter, who's both the love of my life and my closest scientific collaborator. Today I feel even luckier. Thank you, SEP, for giving me such a wonderful honor. Getting this award from a group of colleagues whom I like and admire so much is very precious to me. I feel particularly lucky in getting this award because, after all, this is the Society of Experimental Psychologists, and I'm primarily a theorist. It's true that I've suggested many experiments to colleagues and have made scores of experimental predictions. It's also true that my main talent is seeing to the heart of experimental data. But still, the fact that you have honored me in this way leaves me pleasantly surprised and deeply touched. I never expected to be a theorist. As a lower middle-class Jewish boy growing up in the 1940s and 50s, I was supposed to be a doctor. You know, my son the doctor. I grew up in Jackson Heights, Queens, in New York City, near LaGuardia Airport, in the time-honored tradition that these talks sometimes verge on embarrassingly personal. Here's a picture of me as a baby, and again when I was 2 years old, before I got my first haircut. From a very early age, I emotionally understood that life is short, since my father died of Hodgkin's lymphoma when I was 1 and he was 28. That made me acutely feel that I needed to grow toward something more enduring, to escape toward a life that would hopefully make sense during the precious short time that we're given. My name at birth was Stephen Gottesman. I became Stephen Grossberg when my mother remarried and I was adopted by my new father when I was 5 years old. Here's what I looked like then, and again a few years later when I was 8. The primary way to escape for a boy of my temperament, with essentially no money, was through school. I managed to get into Stuyvesant High School in Manhattan, one of 2 famous special schools that students went to from all over New York if they passed a citywide competitive exam. Stuyvesant was very stimulating, but also ferociously competitive. I worked hard to be first in my class in Stuyvesant as part of my escape plan. Here is me in my high school yearbook, gazing blankly into an unknown future. I went to Dartmouth College, partly because Dartmouth offered me a larger scholarship than other schools. Excuse me. But the clincher was that Dartmouth had a senior fellowship program in which you could do research in your senior year. The senior fellowship would, I hoped, help me to find a direction for my life before I graduated from college. Going to Dartmouth turned out to be a lucky decision for me because my life as a scientist began in 1957 when I took introductory psychology as a freshman. Here's what I looked like then. In that class, I studied data about human verbal learning and animal discrimination learning, among other topics. To me, these data were filled with philosophical paradoxes that I found very exciting. For example, data about serial verbal learning in humans seemed to suggest that events can go backwards in time. In particular, when learning a short list AB, one also learns to perform the reverse list BA with higher probability. However, if C later occurs, the longer list ABC can surely be learned. Well, does this mean that forward associations are stronger than backward associations? And if so, why? As another reflection of events going backwards in time, the Bode serial position curve shows that the beginning and the end of a list can be learned more easily than the middle. This Bode serial position curve is moreover asymmetric, with the most errors occurring nearer to the end than to the beginning of the list. I wondered if this could also arise from the asymmetry between future and past associations. Another striking fact is that the non-occurrence of future items in a list to be learned through an increase in the intertrial interval can dramatically change the distribution of performance errors at all previously occurring list positions. In addition, position-specific error gradients in performance could point forwards in time at the beginning of the list, backwards in time at the end of the list, with both forward and backward gradients in time at the middle of the list. How did both forward and backward learning occur? How could the non-occurrence of future items influence the past? Serial learning data hereby raised a number of basic problems that needed to be solved to better understand all phenomena about serial order and behavior. I gradually realized that these data cried out for a real-time theory using differential equations that could describe how learning changes through time. At that time, I'd only studied some calculus, so this was a scary thought. Before moving forward, I hasten to note that I'll discuss this issue very partially and in its historical order of discovery. As many of you know, one of the main issues in serial learning is, what is the functional stimulus? An issue illustrated by the fact that transfer of learning from serial to paired associate learning is much worse than from paired associate to serial learning. Neural models have proposed an answer, indeed an answer that led to a rich line of research on cognitive processing, but I needed more basic machinery before being able to model what such a functional stimulus might be. Other processes, like covert rehearsal, I won't mention at all today. After a major intellectual struggle, data about forward and backward learning and error distributions forced me into a network formalism. With rapidly changing activities at content-addressable nodes or cells that code for A and B, these activities were also called short-term memory traces. The short-term memory variables are different from more slowly varying learning variables, which are the long-term memory traces or adaptive weights, and which could have different strengths for lists like AB and BA. The spatiotemporal distribution of the short-term memory traces drove the learning of the long-term memory traces and responded to the readout of long-term memory traces through time. To remind us of how very long ago this was, in the same year, 1957, Scoville and Milner published their great paper about the effects of bilateral hippocampectomy on processes that differentially depend on short-term memory and long-term memory. Learning at the model synapses were part of a time-honored tradition of associative learning by many great psychologists. including Pavlov, Hebb, Hull, Thorndike, Skinner, Tolman, and Estes. However, how this learning worked went beyond the concepts of these scientists. That's because my conceptual and mathematical analyses of these networks showed that the functional units of learning are distributed patterns or vectors of long-term memory traces across a network, not individual traces between a particular pair of nodes. In order for a pattern of long-term memory traces to match through learning a pattern of short-term memory traces, some of the long-term memory traces may need to increase while others need to decrease. Thus, the idea of associative thinkers like Donald Hebb that practice always strengthens associations was incorrect. My long-term memory loss combined Hebbian and anti-Hebbian properties, a fact that started to be confirmed experimentally by neurophysiologists like Wolf Singer and Chip Levy 20 years later. I call these long-term memory laws gated steepest descent learning. My mathematical analyses also prove that the long-term memory traces learn the relative activities of the short-term memory traces. Said in another way, the long-term memory traces learn the synchronous part of the short-term memory patterns. This led me to predictions about synchronous dynamics in the mid-1970s that influenced the experimental work of neurophysiologists like Charles Gray and Wolf Singer and Reinhard Eckhorn and his colleagues in the 1980s. In this way, I derived during my freshman year at Dartmouth in 1957 and 58 the paradigm of using systems of nonlinear differential equations to describe neural networks whose short-term memory and long-term memory interactions explain and predict quite a bit of both psychological and neurobiological data. I call the simplest version of this model the additive model because it adds possibly nonlinear terms. So you'd have the time rate of change of the ith activity, could have a decay term, a sum of nonlinear signals times adaptive weights, minus a sum of nonlinear inhibitory signals times adaptive weights, plus an external input. This additive model was generalized to the shunting model that added shunting, excitatory and inhibitory automatic gain control terms that kept the activities within a fixed interval, as in the membrane equations of neurophysiology. And all the learning laws combined Hebbian and anti-Hebbian properties. Notably, the gated steepest descent law had a sampling signal which, when it was on, would enable learning to occur in which the adaptive weight would track some other nonlinear signal. Variants of the additive and shunting models are used today by essentially all biological modelers in computational neuroscience. The properties of the error distributions and the need to control noise also forced me to realize that shunting competition or lateral inhibition operates among the short-term memory variables to determine performance outcomes. As a result of this shunting competition, the networks tended to normalize their short-term memory and long-term memory traces. The short-term memory and long-term memory patterns thus behave like probability distributions, evolving dynamically in real time. This work clarified why our minds find probability concepts so natural, but also that brain dynamics go beyond traditional probability properties, including those of Bayesian models. In addition to these explanations, these models introduced me to a method for linking mind to brain. When I first carried it out in 1957, I did not know any neuroscience, but pre-medical student friends of mine told me facts that they were learning about the brain that already had clear analogs in my model. This connection led me to realize that thinking about how individual behaviors adapt in real time can lead one to derive brain mechanisms that control mental functions. My colleagues and I have repeatedly applied this modeling method for the last 58 years. It has succeeded far beyond anything that I ever dreamed possible. In fact, this method has led to 58 years of rapid progress in modeling how brains give rise to minds. But despite its importance, it's not well reported in the mass media. And it's interesting to ask why. I believe it's because a major scientific paradigm shift is occurring that's required new design principles that unify multiple disciplines, new mathematical concepts and methods, major computer resources, and multiple experimental techniques. In fact, there's been major progress by me and my colleagues on many different areas of mind and brain science. And if you break down each of these areas in turn, then we've done a lot of work on many different aspects of each area, like these are some of the areas just in vision that we've contributed to. Well, what is this paradigm shift? It began in the late 1800s when great scientists such as Helmholtz, Maxwell, and Mach worked in both psychology and physics, and then it accelerated in the 1960s as reviewed in my article in the first issue in 1988 in Neural Networks. I believe this paradigm shift is about understanding how an individual adapts on its own in real time to a complex and changing world. Otherwise expressed, this is about autonomous adaptation to a non-stationary world or adapting to a world filled with unexpected events. This modeling method may be worth reviewing today since it has on multiple occasions successfully linked mind to brain. So if we ask how does a brain give rise to a mind, we need to ask what level of brain organization controls behavior, or what is the functional unit of behavior? Well, I think we can all agree that brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success in order for us to survive. So we need to ask what level of brain processing governs behavioral success? Well, 50 years of modeling suggests that this is the network and system levels, which is why we study neural networks. So we need to ask, how does behavior arise as emergent or interactive properties of cells interacting in neural networks? Well, does this mean that individual neurons are unimportant? Emphatically not, because we need to ask how individual neurons are designed and connected in networks whose emerging properties give rise to these successful behaviors. So we need to simultaneously describe at least three levels: behavior, network, and neuron. And to do that effortlessly, we need a modeling language powerful enough in order to link them. So a main conclusion is, to deeply understand how brains work, you need to understand how evolution selects brain designs based on their behavioral success. And to do that quite naturally, we start with behavioral data that describes the behavior-environment interactions that are selected by evolution. Well, this has led to a modeling method and cycle that clarifies the proper level of abstraction to link brain to mind and operationalizes the sense in which you can't derive a brain in just one step. Well, we always start with scores or hundreds of parametric behavioral experiments, and we analyze them as the outcome of an individual adapting autonomously in real time to a changing world. Well, this is the art of modeling, and carried out properly, it's always led to the discovery of new design or organizational principles for how the brain works. Well, these principles are then converted into the simplest mathematical model using a method of minimal anatomies, or Occam's razor. And then mathematical and computational analysis shows how variations on the minimal anatomy can realize the design principles. Well, importantly, this analysis provides functional explanations and predictions for much larger behavioral databases than those used to discover the design principles. But most remarkably, the behaviorally derived model always looks like part of a brain. And from this, I draw the conclusion that brains look the way that they do to control autonomous adaptation in real time to a changing world. Well, moreover, this behavior, principles, model, neural derivation predicts new functional roles for both known and unknown brain mechanisms. And the power of the method is illustrated by the fact that scores of these predictions about brain and behavior were supported 5 to 30 years after publication. This is emphatically not just curve fitting of data. Now, having made the link to brain, you can press top down from behavior and bottom up from brain to clarify what the model can and cannot explain, and use this boundary between the known and the unknown to focus your attention to identify additional design principles. And then we try to repeat this cycle, adding those new design principles in a self-consistent way to carry out model evolution, progressively unlumping the model to achieve increasing model explanatory and predictive power, leading today to individual models that can explain and predict data about behavior, neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, biophysics, and even biochemistry. Moreover, at every stage, we spin off new model designs and mechanisms to technologists who need autonomous, intelligent adaptations. Now back to 1957. Data about reinforcement learning in animals and about structural balance and cognitive dissonance in humans kindled a similar passionate interest. I wondered, how are thoughts different from feelings? Yet, despite their differences, how can they be combined via cognitive emotional interactions to guide our decisions and actions to realize valued goals? Just as in the case of serial learning, the non-occurrence of an event during reinforcement learning could have dramatic consequences. For example, the non-occurrence of an expected reward can trigger reset of cognitive working memory, emotional frustration, and exploratory motor activity to discover new ways to get the reward. For example, if you go to the refrigerator expecting to eat Thanksgiving turkey leftovers for lunch, but there's unexpectedly no food left in the refrigerator, you might feel a wave of frustration. You can also then shift your attention and start to explore other ways to get lunch rather than perseverating in front of the empty refrigerator until you starve to death. This sort of consideration forced me to ask, well, what is an expectation, mechanistically speaking? What is a reward? How can an unexpected non-occurrence of a reward cause an antagonistic rebound from a positive emotion like hunger to a negative emotion like frustration? Moreover, how are representations of these positive and negative emotions linked together in opponent processes that can generate antagonistic rebounds, both in response to changes in the intensity of affective stimuli as well as to unexpected non-occurrences, like when there are no turkey leftovers in the refrigerator and you feel frustrated. The same short-term memory and long-term memory laws that help me to explain and predict data about verbal learning now help during the 1970s to begin to explain and predict data about classical and instrumental conditioning. My derivation of short-term memory and long-term memory laws in the 1950s led me to then also derive a third kind of law beyond short-term memory and long-term memory, the so-called medium-term memory, or MTM trace, which I also call a habituative transmitter gate. Medium-term memory is also sometimes called a depressing synapse or dynamic synapse after the 1997 articles of Larry Abbott and his colleagues on visual cortex and of Henry Markram and Misha Tzadok on somatosensory cortex, in which they experimentally demonstrated predicted medium-term memory properties and rederived my model from their data. Let me briefly show you how the medium-term memory law can be derived from a simple Gedanken or thought experiment about how to achieve unbiased transduction between two cells. Well, let's say you have an input signal S and an output signal T, which is an unbiased reflection of the input S. Well, the simplest kind of unbiased is that just T is proportional to S with a proportionality constant B. That's the gain or sensitivity of the transformation. But now let's suppose that T is due to the release of a chemical transmitter Y at a synapse. Well, if we want to get these laws, we would write T is S times Y, which is just mass action release or inactivation of the transmitter. And then we want to insist that Y try to stay accumulated to B to maintain sensitivity. Well, this can't occur at all times unless accumulation is infinitely fast, but nothing in biology is infinitely fast, so we need a differential equation for the time rate of change of transmitter to accumulate to B and be inactivated or released by mass action. Well, evolution has exploited this difference of rates. For example, let's say the input starts low, jumps rather quickly up, stays up here, jumps down rather quickly, goes down here. Well, the habituative gate is slower because this starts low, it starts high. Then when this jumps up, it gradually habituates. Then when this jumps down, it gradually recovers. But the output is the input times the gate, and their product looks like this. You have a baseline, you have an overshoot, habituation, undershoot, habituation. Well, what functional capabilities did medium-term memory add? One such capability is intracellular Webb-Law adaptation, illustrated by this denominator term due to the habituative gate, which is important in explaining intracellular data about vertebrate photoreceptors and other neurons. Its main power arose, however, in opponent processing circuits that I introduced in 1972, and I called gated dipoles. Gated dipoles enabled me to understand how an antagonistic rebound can be caused by a sudden change in the intensity of a reinforcing input or due to the non-occurrence of an expected reward, like the unexpected lack of turkey leftovers. So this is a circuit of the simplest gated dipole. It has an on channel and it has an off channel. It has a phasic input that can turn on and off like a reinforcing input. Then it has a tonic input that is fed to both channels. In the simplest case, the tonic input is constant and both the on and off channel get the same input. So the on channel gets the phasic plus the tonic input, So the activity of this cell looks like this. Then you go through a habituative gate. It tries to stay unbiased, but it can fall a little behind, so you get an overshoot, habituation, undershoot, habituation. Well, the off channel only has to contend with a constant arousal, so you have a constant activity here and here. And after all, this is an opponent processing circuit, so you subtract the off channel from the on channel, thereby shifting this activity down. Now to get an output signal, you rectify this curve, and you get a habituative on response. Well, what do you get in the off channel? In the off channel, you flip excitation and inhibition. That is the effect of flipping this curve. And now when you rectify the output of the off channel, you get your antagonistic rebound. So it's just due to having some arousal, habituative transmitter gates that try to stay unbiased, competition, and rectification. In particular, I proved how a sudden increase in arousal, a sudden arousal burst, due to an unexpected event, could cause an antagonistic rebound. This fact thrust me into thinking about how cognitive events, like top-down expectations and their disconfirmation by an unexpected event, can cause an arousal burst and thereby influence reinforcement learning. This is one of the paths that led me to discover adaptive resonance theory. I was also able to mathematically prove that gated dipoles experience a golden mean, or inverted U, as a function of arousal. This fact forced me into thinking about how when the proper level of tonic arousal cannot be maintained, symptoms of various mental disorders can arise. Antagonistic rebounds occur in many modalities, including vision, as illustrated by negative after effects like the Mackay illusion during form perception and the waterfall illusion during motion perception. This observation thrust me into studying vision. In particular, why does the brain process form in the parvocellular cortical stream from V1 through V2 to V4, and motion through the magnocellular cortical stream from V1 to MT to MST, despite the fact that individual cells in V1 are already sensitive to properties of both form and motion. This turned out to be an example of complementary computing, which I'll say more about soon. The above examples illustrate how the emergent properties of a basic circuit design, such as a gated dipole for opponent processing, can lead one to unexpected data explanations by using simple mathematics and to mechanistically unify and predict large databases about apparently unrelated behavioral functions. The laws for short-term memory, medium-term memory, and long-term memory also raise the opposite question. How many laws are there? How many circuit designs are there? Is the brain just an endless bag of tricks, as even famous scientists like Ramachandran have written? If that were the case, it would be impossible to develop integrative theories of mind and brain. Fortunately, it is not. True theories are emerging in which just a small number of equations with a somewhat large number of modules or microcircuits, including opponent processing networks. You take specialized combinations of these microcircuits using just a small number of basic equations and assemble them in architectures that solve what I like to call modal problems for different modalities of intelligence, such as vision, audition, and so on. Well, what principles determine how modal architectures are designed? To answer this, we've been led to new paradigms for brain computing. One of these paradigms I like to call laminar computing, which asks, why is it that all neocortical circuits are organized in layers? How does having laminar circuits enable you to give rise to all kinds of biological intelligence? A key research goal of laminar computing is to develop a comprehensive theory of how laminar neocortical circuits are specialized for different types of intelligence, a task that may very well take another century. However, we already have a good start. We have models of 3D vision, of speech perception and cognition that all use specializations of the same canonical laminar circuitry. So we already have an existence proof that we can succeed in this task. Well, what's complementary computing? Complementary computing asks what's the nature of brain specialization. Complementary computing points to new principles of uncertainty and complementarity that clarify why there are multiple parallel processing streams in the brain, as illustrated by this famous picture of the multiple stages of processing in the vision system due to Van Essen and his colleagues. Well, what are complementary properties? First, let me tell you in words and then through example to make it clearer. Well, there are analogies, like a lock fitting in its key, or puzzle pieces fitting together. So again, just in words, computing one set of properties at a processing stage prevents that stage from computing a complementary set of properties. And these complementary parallel processing streams are balanced against one another in such a way that interactions between the streams overcome their complementary weaknesses and support intelligent and creative behaviors. And I say this with some confidence because now we know quite a few pairs of complementary processes, of which these are just a few. Well, the earliest one that I discovered was the complementarity between boundaries and surfaces, as illustrated by neon color spreading. I hope you can all see the blue here. It's not really in the image, which is just put together by black and blue arcs. If we think about how boundary completion is occurring in our percept, how do we form this emergent square boundary? Well, this is done between pairs or greater numbers of inducers that complete boundaries inwardly between pairs or greater numbers of inducers in an oriented fashion. However, if we think about the surface filling in, whereby we see the blue color, all the blue is spilling out of these little locations here where the blue and black are joined, and it spills out and it flows outwardly in an unoriented fashion. So boundary surfaces, oriented, unoriented, inward, outward. Well, where's this happening in the brain? Well, the prediction is that the boundaries go through the interblob stream to V4 and the surfaces through the blob stream. I should note this is not the same as the Livingstone and Hubel hypothesis that you have an orientation system and a color system. There are striking differences between these predictions. Well, what does it mean for boundaries to be insensitive to direction of contrast? This has to do with the fundamental distinction between seeing versus knowing. For example, if you look at this offset grading, I hope you can all recognize that there's a salient, distinct vertical boundary here, but you don't really see it. It's not a different color or a different depth. So you can consciously recognize something you don't see. In other words, some boundaries are invisible or amodal. But in fact, well, before saying that, let me just point out that amodal boundaries are very useful they help to recognize objects in textured scenes, such as this famous example of the Dalmatian in snow, where you can begin to better recognize the Dalmatian as you build invisible boundaries to further complete its bounding contour. I predicted, actually, that all boundaries are invisible within the boundary stream. And one reason is to recognize object boundaries in front of textured backgrounds. So if you think about this gray disk in front of this black and white checkerboard textured background, as we go around its circumference, we have a gray-white region, which is dark-light. We have a gray-black region, which is light-dark. Dark-light, light-dark, dark-light, light-dark. If we had one boundary formed with the dark-light pieces, there'd be a lot of holes in it. And if we had another boundary formed with the light-dark pieces, it would have a lot of holes in it. But we want a boundary around the whole object, and so the assumption is that oriented dark-light detectors and light-dark detectors at every position combine their inputs into the next processing stage, which is insensitive to direction of contrast. It will respond to both dark light and light dark, and thereby at those cells, which turn out to be the complex cells in V1 of visual cortex, you already would have a boundary around the entire object. Well, insensitive direction of contrast means all boundaries are invisible in the boundary stream, because by pooling over light dark and dark light to get a good boundary, you've thrown away the ability to represent a contrast difference. So if boundaries are invisible, then how do we see? And I propose this is due to filling in of surface, lightness, and color, where boundaries define the compartments within which lightness and color spread. Like in this case, you have a circular boundary and you see the brightness of the Ehrenstein disk. Here again, you have a circular boundary and you see the spreading color of neon color spreading. So the idea is that all boundaries are invisible and that sensitivity direction of contrast has to do with filling in a visible color and lightness, oriented, unoriented, inward, outward, insensitive, sensitive. They're complementary to be a good boundary. You can't be a good surface and conversely, but they need to interact for anything useful to happen. So that led me to predict in '84 that all boundaries are invisible in the interblob cortical stream, and visible qualia are surface percepts in the blob cortical stream. Well, if you put together several of these complementary properties, you're led to an emerging unified theory of visual intelligence from retina through prefrontal cortex, including both the what and the where cortical streams. And I believe many of these interactions are there to overcome complementary processing deficiencies of each process acting on its own. Well, back to Dartmouth. Dartmouth provided a great environment for me to start my work. John Kemeny was at that time chairman of the mathematics department, co-inventor of the computer language BASIC, and co-founder of the path-breaking Dartmouth computer time-sharing system. He also encouraged math students to study social sciences, and I became the first joint major in mathematics and psychology at Dartmouth. Al Hasdorf was chairman of the psychology department and a wonderful mentor. Al left Dartmouth for Stanford when I did and became a much beloved dean, provost, and vice president there. With their support, I did, after all, become a senior fellow during my senior year at Dartmouth and worked full-time during my senior year to develop my neural models of mind. When it came time to go to graduate school in 1961, I had to choose a major. I knew that the kind of theoretical psychology and neuroscience that was looming in outline before me was a full-time job. Full-time theory was, however, not a familiar role in psychology departments then. So Kemeny advised me that if my neural models led to interest in mathematics, I could possibly survive as an applied mathematician. I followed his advice and went to Stanford as a mathematics graduate student. I chose Stanford to be close to the famous mathematical psychologists at the Institute for Mathematical Studies in the Social Sciences, including Bill Estes, Dick Atkinson, Gordon Bower, and Pat Soubise. At Stanford, the mathematical psychologists were mostly doing stimulus sampling theory and were unaccustomed to the idea of deriving properties of individual behavior from real-time adaptive neural networks. And the mathematicians were perplexed by a mathematics student who was committed to doing theoretical psychology and neuroscience. I therefore left Stanford in 1964 with a master's in mathematics and transferred to the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now the Rockefeller University in Manhattan. Rockefeller at that time boasted famous neuroscientists as well as mathematicians and physicists who might be interested in behavioral and neural modeling. Excuse me. Notably, the distinguished probability theorist and statistical physicist Mark Katz. I received a PhD in mathematics from Rockefeller in 1967 for a thesis that proved the first global content addressable memory theorems about the neural learning models that I had discovered at Dartmouth. My PhD thesis advisor was Giancarlo Rota, whose unusual breadth as a mathematician and philosopher enabled him to provide personal and political support for my unusual research interests. Here's what I looked like when I was a graduate student at Rockefeller. As you can see, I was going through my hippie period then. You might think that everything was going smoothly for me now, but it was not and would not for a number of years. For example, Giancarlo, though a wonderful man and brilliant, was manic depressive and landed in the hospital as I was finishing my PhD thesis. No one else believed the theorems that I proved for my thesis, embodying as they did new intuitions about how learning works. Fortunately, Mark Katz was willing to put my theorems to the test by getting them simulated on Stan Ulam's computer at Los Alamos that Stan usually used to simulate hydrogen bomb explosions. Stan also didn't believe the theorems at first, but the computer did, so I survived that challenge and got my PhD. So if anyone asks, is there any historical connection between the H-bomb and learning theory, here is at least one. In 1967, I was hired as an assistant professor of applied mathematics at MIT on the strength of my PhD thesis and strong recommendations from Katz and Rota. Here's my picture as a young assistant professor of applied mathematics at MIT. At MIT, Norman Levinson, at that time the most famous MIT mathematician and an institute professor, and his wife Zipporah Orfegi generously treated me like a scientific son. Norman also strongly supported my modeling work. In 1969, I was promoted to associate professor and promised tenure. MIT at that time promoted to associate professor faculty who they expected to award tenure when we became full professors. However, I came up for tenure when the first major recession after World War II hit America. MIT joined a lot of universities in firing most of their faculty at tenure time, including me. Luckily for me, the president of Boston University, John Silber, was on a talent hunt, and I was appointed a full professor at Boston University in 1975. John Silber and the BU Dean and Provost Dennis Berkey believed in the value of what I was doing. In this supportive BU environment, I was able to found the Department of Cognitive and Neural Systems, several interdisciplinary research centers, and various international institutions, such as the International Neural Network Society and the journal Neural Networks. I also organized many scientific conferences and so on. These initiatives were part of my lifelong efforts to try to make learning and working in the field a little easier for younger modelers than it had been for me. Before ending, I'd like to sketch how simple beginnings with short-term memory, long-term memory, and medium-term memory laws, combined with the modeling method's unlumping process, pointed me straight toward cognition, emotion, and action studies. Well, first, the simplest circuit for spatial pattern learning goes on in what I call an outstar, because it can be drawn like this. In an outstar, a sampling input like a conditioned stimulus will sample through adaptive weight some distributed output pattern like a conditioned response, and the outstar learns this spatial pattern. Well, if you flip the pathway directions, you get an instar, and an instar acts as an adaptive filter whereby you can learn to selectively activate a recognition category. Now, if you put together multiple instars with recurrent shunting competition, you'll lead to competitive learning and self-organizing map models. And this class of models illustrates how simple mechanisms working together in specialized anatomies can explain challenging data as emergent properties. For example, let's consider development of visual cortical area V1. We developed a lamina cortical self-organizing map model that can develop multiple of the key properties in this lamina model of V1, and then use the learned connections to simulate adult psychophysical and neurophysiological data from animal and human subjects about perceptual grouping. Is neurophysiological data about grouping? Is a model simulation? And about attention. Is physiological data about attention? Is a simulation? So this single model unifies data about cortical development and adult neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, and psychophysics. Now, in a very different area, a hierarchy of self-organizing maps can help to learn entorhinal grid cells and hippocampal play cells, a topic that won this past year's Nobel Prize for the great work of John O'Keefe and Edvarda Maybrick-Moser. This model helped to simulate how these very different kinds of receptive fields can self-organize in real time, and also quantitatively simulates many of the parametric properties, for example, of entorhinal grid cells along the dorsoventral gradient in the medial entorhinal cortex. Well, you're never done in this business, and I proved in 1976 when I did competitive learning and self-organizing maps that they experience catastrophic forgetting, and was then able to introduce adaptive resonance theory to dynamically stabilize category learning using top-down learned expectations and the focusing of attention. And in fact, in the models I just mentioned of vision, there's a top-down identified pathway carrying out attention and dynamically stabilizing learning, as well as in the entorhinal hippocampal cortex model, and there's strong physiological and psychophysical data supporting the existence of these pathways and Art's predictions about how they work. So adaptive resonance theory, or ART, was introduced in 1976, a unifying theme that motivates the theory is what I call the stability-plasticity dilemma. In particular, how can learning continue into and through adulthood without causing catastrophic forgetting? Or how can we learn quickly without being forced to forget just as quickly? I'm proud to be able to say that all the key art predictions now have both behavioral and neurobiological support, including the predicted link between processes of consciousness, learning, expectation, attention, resonance, and synchrony by multiple labs. These are not the same processes, but they are all linked in particular ways as predicted by the theory. This is what I looked like when art was being introduced in 1976. I was then a very happy guy with my wife Gail in Paris. Well, what about space-time pattern learning? What about associative learning and ritualistic performance of an arbitrary act? What's the minimum number of cells do you need to do this? Well, the minimum number is 1. Couldn't get more minimum than that. And that illustrates how small brains can carry out complex reflexes. But then why do we need big brains? Well, first let's see what goes wrong if you just use one cell. This is a class of models called avalanche models that I introduced in 1969, in which you sample an arbitrary space-time pattern or act as a sequence of spatial patterns, much as you see a movie as a sequence of still pictures. So you have a sampling signal that goes down this long axon and activates a series of outstars at successively later times, each outstar learning a particular spatial pattern of the space-time pattern, and then later when you turn this cell on again, it recalls the space-time pattern as a sequence of spatial patterns, much as you see a movie as a sequence of still pictures, just one big cell. However, there's a big problem here. It's totally insensitive to feedback. After performance starts, it can't stop. So you need to be able to adapt to environmental feedback, and that requires lots more cells. And how it happens leads straight to cognitive emotional mechanisms. Well, to get started, we need, in addition, nonspecific arousal. So to fire any cell in an avalanche, now you need a converging specific input and nonspecific arousal input. So if you shut off nonspecific arousal, you could stop performance and switch to something else. If you increase arousal, you could perform faster by exceeding threshold faster, or slower by making arousal smaller. And in fact, nonspecific arousal is an ancient discovery. It's a command cell all the way back to crayfish swimmerettes in regulating the swimming behavior of a crayfish. It's also conserved through quite a few species. For example, the songbird pattern generator is also an avalanche, as Fee and his colleagues showed in 2002. Here's their diagram. But again, you're never done here. We need to ask about self-organizing space-time command structures. In particular, in the case of the crayfish, you want the command cell only to fire in response to appropriate signals. You don't want it, you want it to avoid escaping from food, for example. It needs to go toward food. So toward cognition, to build on these circuits, we need to adaptively filter the inputs to the command cell so that only appropriate inputs could turn it on. And after multiple stages of unlumping, that led to models like the 3D Laminat model for 3D vision and figure ground perception, and the 3D ArtScan search model for invariant object learning recognition and 3D search after many years of incremental model development and discovery. Well, toward emotion, only important signals can turn arousal on and off. And so in addition to adaptive filtering, you need conditioned arousal to determine what set of cues can turn arousal on and off, raising the question, how is reinforcement related to a cue's conditioned arousal? Moreover, there can be multiple arousal sources and competition can occur between conditioned arousal sources, leading to the concept of drive representation, where homeostatic and reinforcing cues converge, such as the amygdala. And again, after multiple stages of unlumping, that led to models like the motivator model, which clarifies how brain regions like amygdala and lateral hypothalamus interact with the basal ganglia and sensory cortices and orbitofrontal cortex in order to regulate reinforcement learning and performance. Well, we also need to self-organize our avalanches further, in addition to adaptive instars to learn categories and outstars to be able to read out cognitive expectations and motor responses that are learned. We also need to learn the serial order to link these categories in the right order through time. And that leads us back again to the old story of serial list learning. And does serial learning use associative chaining? Well, I already indicated that chaining is not sufficient. In particular, there was strong evidence way back that the functional stimulus in learning, serial learning, is not individual items like in these transfer data I mentioned earlier. And I would propose that what you really need are context-sensitive list chunks of item sequences. So first one needs to understand chunking and how working memory temporarily stores the item sequences that are chunked or unitized in order to fully understand even serial learning. So that led to the study of working memory, or the short-term memory storage of event sequences. In particular, how are working memories designed in the brain? Well, I was inspired by free recall and related linguistic data to impose what I call the long-term memory invariance principle starting in 1978. The long-term memory invariance principle predicts that working memories are designed so that storage of new items in short-term memory does not disrupt the long-term memory of previously stored item groupings. In particular, it doesn't pay to temporarily store a sequence of events if you can't stably learn about them. So, for example, suppose you've already learned the words my, self, and elf. My, elf, and self, they already have their own little categories. Now, how do you store in working memory and learn a category for the new word myself without forcing unselective forgetting of its familiar subwords, which if it occurred would be catastrophic? We take this hypothesis for granted, but it has real teeth, and it forced me into what I call item and order working memories, and then Houghton later called them competitive queuing models. And in such an item and order working memory, an event sequence in time is stored as an evolving spatial pattern of activity across a network of content addressable item chunks. If you have a primacy gradient of working memory, meaning the first item in has the biggest activity, the next item has the next biggest activity, and so on, that is going to store the correct temporal order at the content addressable cells because the maximally activated cell population is performed next when a volitional rehearsal wave is turned on. So if you started out the first item with the highest activity, the first item will be performed first. And then the output signal from the chosen cell population inhibits its own activity to prevent perseveration of that item for all time, thereby clarifying how inhibition of return works. And then you iterate this until the entire sequence is performed. I also showed how a recurrent shunning on-center off-surround network automatically obeys the long-term memory invariance principle. Remember, they compute relative activities, thereby illustrating how something seemingly as sophisticated as a working memory could emerge through evolution by just specializing ubiquitously occurring kind of circuit. Well, let's say you started with a primacy gradient for a short list, and you have constant attention to items coming in. As more and more items come in, that's always going to lead to a Bode gradient, and their activity is going to be forced down due to this normalization by shunting competition. So the long-term memory invariance principle implies remarkably that to get stability of learned temporal order in long-term memory, not to be able to wipe out those subchunks, causes non-veridical storage of temporal order in short-term memory for long enough lists. You can only get a primacy gradient for sufficiently short lists. And that immediately explains targeted free recall data, but now in a very adaptive way, because a bow implies that items at the beginning and the end of the list are performed earlier and with higher probability, and you can easily explain things like transposition errors and on and on. Moreover, the long-term memory invariance principle made a big prediction that all working memories, whether linguistic, motor, or spatial, should have similar circuits and similar error distributions to obey long-term memory invariance. And it also predicts an intimate link between working memory and chunking because you've designed the working memory to enable stable chunking. I'm happy to be able to say there's now experimental evidence for all these assumptions. Well, what about linguistic and motor working memories? There's a lot of data, but let me just quote from Farrell and Lewandowski. They wrote that several competing theories of short-term memory exist, but that their own error latency data rule out 3 of the 4 representational mechanisms. The data support the notion that serial order is represented by a primacy gradient that is accompanied by suppression of recalled items, just as I predicted. But the clinchers started coming in from neurophysiological data supporting my prediction, notably starting in 2002 from Apostolos Georgopoulos' lab under the leadership of Bruno Avebeck, who did extracellular recording in the macaque periprincipalis region during joystick-controlled copying. So the macaques are trying to learn how to make sequences of arm movements. And here they recorded the primacy gradient. There it is. The most active one is recalled first, self-inhibits, then the next active one, the next, and the next. And then, having freed the last item from inhibition from everything else, it's disinhibited and is always most active, thereby providing evidence as well for the idea that there's a competitive shunting recurrent network going on here. Well, after multiple stages of model development, we were able to publish the list-parse laminar cortical model of working memory and list chunking. Here, for example, is a simulation of some of the motor data in the model. But it also simulated linguistic data about immediate, delayed, and continuous distractive free recall and immediate serial recall in humans. Well, what about spatial working memory using a similar model? The list-telos model simulated how posterior parietal cortex, prefrontal cortex, supplementary eye fields, frontal eye fields, and superior colliculus interact with 3 basal ganglia loops to learn and perform sequences of saccadic eye movements. And here the item in order working memory model was generalized to an item order rank working memory model, which could store sequences of items, some of which are repeated at multiple list positions. And this item in order rank model of spatial working memory simulates behavioral, electrophysiological, anatomical, and here's some microsimulation data from Earl Miller's lab. Those are the data, and there is the model simulation of it. Okay. The last 58 years of theorizing have been more intellectually exciting and productive than I could ever have hoped. Here's a list from Wikipedia of models that I've developed with many gifted collaborators. These are some of them, and these are some more of them in various different areas. Being able to learn so much about mind and brain is another big reason why I feel like a lucky guy. I've tried to be worthy of this good luck, and I'm still excited to learn more about how our minds work. Here are some of my current research interests. Your wonderful Anna, SEP, has given this whole man a very big boost to keep unplugging. Thank you so very much.